Let me have your attention for a minute. This is something for the ladies. I'm chilling with the queens of the Stoned Age.
Welcome to Queens of the Stoned Age, the show where queens get stoned and talk about whatever we feel like that day. I'm Mira Gonzalez. I am your managing editor for Mary Jane, which is a cannabis news and media site owned by Snoop Dogg. Today we are here with Conner Habib, who is a writer, lecturer, gay adult performer, and host of the podcast, which I love, called Against Everyone with Conner Habib. And then we're also with Dr. Heather Berg, who is a feminist studies scholar, and she teaches at the University of Southern California. Her work explores labor, sex work, sexuality, and resistance. How are you guys doing?
What's up?
Good.
Hey. Thanks for coming on today.
Thanks for having us.
Very
I appreciate it. So you guys wrote a piece for Mary Jane's Sex Week, which was just a couple weeks ago, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know when this is going to come out, but, a few weeks ago, about the intersection of the war on drugs and sex work, in addition to sex work and its role in socialist movements and in feminist movements as of modern times now. Mm-hmm. And so that was really fascinating. And so I wanted to bring you guys on to just sort of discuss it in another context that people can enjoy and see and hear your lovely voices, see your lovely faces. And so to start, in the piece, one of the first quotes that I saw from you, Heather, that I was really interested in was a quote that you said, the point of connection between sex worker communities and the readers of Mary Jane is or could be that they are all fighting for the right to be unproductive. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if maybe we could start by you explaining that a little bit.
Right. Yeah, well, I think one of the things that Conner has taught me a lot about is like that the problem with bad sex is it is about sex, but one thing we talk about a lot is that it's also about doing something that has you away from work,
right.
Which is, of course, not true for sex workers,
right.
Where these things meet. But I think that, that historically, a lot of the problem with sex work is that it is sex that is not productive in terms of being reproductive.
Right.
And then I think, of course, as you're about to start grinding here,
I think put some nice weed in here from,
yes.
From the lovely Green Angels, by the way, who I forgot to shout out in the beginning, and our sponsors, and get lovely weed if you're in Los Angeles.
What's up, Green Angels?
Yeah.
All right.
Anyways, continue.
Yeah. So pot two puts us in this place where we're not work ready in the ways that we should be. And of course, all of this gets so messy now, a year after legalization, mm-hmm. when pot is absolutely work. It has been in the gray and black market for a long time. And so I don't want to romanticize either sex work or we could say drug work and saying that they're outside the market. That's obviously not true. But I do think that a lot of the stigma around both of these things has to do with their capacity to take us out of work.
Right. It's the fact that, you don't, if you're doing independent sex work or if you're dealing drugs, you don't have a boss, you don't have an hourly rate, you're kind of able to escape. And I think that's, why I wanted to have you here, Conner, because obviously you can speak firsthand to the experience of being able to and having, a job that is a job and that makes money and that helps you survive, but is not something where you have to participate in, non-consensual agreement that you are going to be performing waged work. And, I wonder, it's interesting because I see a lot of movements happening now and happening in the past that are, supposedly anti-capitalist. They're socialist movements, feminist movements. And I see sex workers specifically and sex work being left out of those narratives. And I wonder, considering what you're saying, Heather, that sex work and drug dealing are both, really powerful ways to escape that kind of system. I wonder why, Conner, do you think that sex work specifically is being left out of those movements?
Yeah, well, I think that the thing that I want people who call themselves progressive or leftists or even just liberals to think about is that that sex workers have a lot to offer them. It's not just that it's a one-way street where they're giving to us and our community. We have a lot to offer them. And why? Because we're a class of people who have been oppressed, suppressed, repressed in our jobs, in our sexual autonomy, and in our choices in many, many, many different ways. And so we had to come up with all these different kinds of strategies to live and ways to contend with that. And so when we have when we make decisions that fly in the face of sexual norms, right? So if you're a woman and you make porn and you say, I do this because I love doing it. Not all women who make porn say that. But if you are a woman, yes, exactly. If you're a woman who makes porn, you're flying in the face of everything people say about like women having sexual desires. If you're a guy, a straight guy who says, I'm going to do porn, you're flying in the face of what everybody's saying you should do as a provider for your family and starting this like, and being in this kind of specific
nuclear
work
family
provider
idea
role.
Right.
Yeah. So why do some people feel the freedom to be able to do that? People should be asking sex workers that question.
Yeah.
And people should be looking in on this community of sex workers and saying, okay, like this is, you're doing sex work in a culture that refuses to work on sex. We don't think about sex. We don't talk about it in any sort of evolved or like thoughtful way.
We don't have education on it.
And we certainly don't do it with work either.
Yep.
And sex workers are doing all of that. So it's like, we got that to give
How
back
did you
to
escape? That's like that's useful information for anyone in a socialist movement.
Yeah, and I think people who are on the left as well as the right, but I think unfortunately, particularly like leftists, of whom I share many politics with, they're used to thinking that they're so radical that nothing could be outside of it, and that they want to be like, look at what we as leftists and liberals and progressives have to offer you. And it's like, no, not so fast.
Right.
Why don't you step back and hear what we have to offer you, and maybe you can take some of that up and improve your politics.
Right, because what is a movement if you're not, looking to the exact people who the movement is about, which is, laborers who are being exploited or who are not getting proper protections. And obviously all laborers are exploited in my view, and sex workers are obviously not getting the protection and the support that they need and deserve for doing difficult and I would say necessary work. And, in terms of bringing it back to cannabis specifically, I can speak to the fact that lots of people use cannabis as medicine for various different reasons. And, somebody had to provide that before it was legal. And so, that person, I think that it's an interesting time that we're in where, we see people who are benefiting monetarily in massive, massive ways from the cannabis industry while kind of ignoring the history of cannabis and of, what it is, which is like inextricably tied to racial issues, to criminal justice issues, to mass incarceration and all these different things, and I think that I wonder about this industry specifically in that I cannot think of an industry currently that is not involved in sex work and yet is friendly to sex workers. And I do see a couple of companies, in the cannabis space that are friendly to sex workers. I see companies like Foria really actively working to be sure that that is known about them. But I also see companies that are trying to deny that past and trying to say that cannabis, should no longer borrow from the aesthetics of porn. And, I think they've been doing it for a long time. And I wonder why that is. And I can't help but feel like, is it because the bigger an industry gets, the less friendly it is to sex workers? Or is it for another reason? And I wonder what your guys' input would be on that, just in terms of cannabis specifically being something that was so recently illegal and suddenly it's not, and yet we're not embracing sex work, which is the same basically.
You want to take that up?
I think like in broader movement history more generally, like inclusion kills critique. And so like one of the most radical things about sex worker communities and before legalization, growing communities, dealing communities, has been a shared understanding that the state is not for us. Institutions are not for us. And people forget that almost immediately when
as soon as there's money involved.
And this illusion of inclusion and protection. So I think that's really dangerous. And so what that means is like you start to trust institutions that are still not for you and throw people under the bus who haven't been ushered in.
Right. Yeah, that totally makes sense, definitely. And I think that, in the thought that I've done in preparation for this about, just the overlap between the war on drugs and the systems that enforce the criminalization of sex work currently, and cannabis in states where it's not legal, are so similar, and especially in that, in the cannabis industry and in the sex work industry, there are aspects of both of those lines of work that are legal. Pornography is technically legal and, having a dispensary is technically legal. But then there's massive, massive gray areas where so much of it is totally criminalized and horrible. And so I would definitely be interested in what your guys' take is on why certain aspects of the sex work industry specifically and the cannabis industry too are legalized when other aspects are, so tabooed. And, obviously it's all tabooed for sex work, unfortunately. But, why is it that pornography specifically is legal in certain circumstances and not legal in others?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we shouldn't forget that some of these hard-won battles for whether it's decriminalization of sex work, legalization of certain kinds of sex work, decriminalization, legalization of certain drug use and drugs, it's like and drug work. I think that the idea behind those hard-won, those came from. I mean, those came from a really active place that people were really pushing. So it's like
and for decades,
yes, exactly. And in a lot of cases, we're guided by what I would say are radical politics. But then you get into it is linked to what you were just saying. You get into this place where, as soon as you get on the other side of that, people start practicing respectability politics because it's so precarious. I mean, you can barely blame certain people for doing that. It's so precarious that when
you've been doing something illegal your whole life,
exactly. Yeah. Exactly. But I also think that going back to what Heather was saying before about it being not productive, I would say that has a lot to do with the way these regulations take place. So as soon as something is seen as a threat to culture in one way or another, that's like the overriding corporate and economic structure, whatever. Okay. Sorry, I'm getting a little ahead of myself.
Are you good? We're not stoned yet.
Yeah. I kind of am. That's how easily I get stoned. Just like from smelling all this. Yeah, totally.
Are you really?
I might be. I don't know. Yeah, you've never heard me be like...
Is that possible?
Yeah, not like that.
No.
So I don't know if that's possible.
On the science.
I'm
I don't know.
such a lightweight. This is the problem.
It might just be like the presence of the Snoop cutout.
Exactly.
And all
I'm
of
really
that.
intimidated by him in the back of me.
People tell me my aura makes them stoned, so...
What I would say is that that these are drugs and sex are ways to alter your states of consciousness, right? Okay. And especially sex is constantly available to us, and pornography is always available to us. Whether we're watching on the screen, it's available to us in our imagination.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then when we, start to masturbate or share porn with other people or whatever. So I think that these are two pathways that allow us to alter our states of consciousness. And so these are wars on consciousness that have been really threatening to people and institutions in power for a long time for various reasons. Because once you start to self-actualize by investigating your own consciousness and what is this and what's this, that really is a threat to power.
You realize work is bullshit.
Yes, exactly. Who the hell wants to go to work, right?
Nobody wants to go to
I
work.
want to go on an adventure with my mind and my body and my relationships
or I want
to
to have
other
sex.
people.
I want to do drugs. I want to have fun.
Yeah, and so that really can. So it's, I think, when our economic system and the people and institutions in power find a way that they think they can kind of get in and control things. So I think sometimes what we call a win is actually them kind of realizing, but we know how to regulate.
Right,
now,
I can benefit off of this.
And so the only thing that protects us from that is realizing, again, one, that it's an engagement with our own consciousness, and two, keeping those alliances with the people that are doing the radical stuff and the radical activism alive, because that will protect us from them encroaching on it.
Right, yeah, and I see this happening in the cannabis space very much so, where, a lot of the same people who are advocates for legalization are the same people who are advocates for anti-mass incarceration movements and things like that, that have been tied with the movement. And I think that the only companies or the only situations that I've seen where, companies that are monetarily successful are also vying for these things are ones where those are the people who create the company. And I think that is probably also difficult in that a lot of the people who are engaging in independent sex work or drug dealing are the kind of people who don't want to be bosses necessarily, don't want to have a business that's, the traditional model of like an American business.
Right.
And I think that is one of the most fascinating things to me about, this job that I'm in, but especially about sex work is, just that it's a way to escape a system that was forced on us non-consensually. We didn't agree to always have a boss for the rest of our lives and to only do wage work forever. And so to me, when I see somebody who's able to escape that, like you said, Conner, my first thought is to say, how did you do it? Can you teach me? Basically, like how do you escape having a boss? Because even with the best job, even working for Snoop Dogg is still a fucking job, and like, you know, no job is great. No job is good. Like, it's all jobs.
If you're allowed to say that on air, you're better than
exactly.
Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Totally. Yeah.
That's, and you know, like, I do not take that for granted. Certainly,
Yeah.
like I used to work in publishing, and it was like super uptight and like really intense, and definitely not this. Like, I was not able to roll a blunt and like talk about things that I care about.
Your job sucks.
Yeah, but fuck this job. No, I like this job.
I think like we have to be careful too not to overstate the escape part, because there's in so many ways
it's
sex
hard
work
and
has
dangerous.
the same tediums. Not even, I mean, dangerous, but also tediums.
Right, tedious,
I mean,
for sure.
Like,
you have to do your taxes. Like,
and you know, self-marketing all of the time, and preparing the body for work, and sometimes using medicine to heal from a hard day. Like, so in so many ways, I think
it's physical labor in the truest sense.
Yeah, and I think that that in terms of like what this looks like for the world of weed, we should be really careful not to let pot become productive. So there's this real risk that this is now a release valve for workers who are being
We're going to end up working still.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now they hate it a little less because they can take a mint halfway through the day.
Right. Yeah, and I'm interested in we've all been using the word productive to describe a certain thing, and I wonder what would be your guys' definition of productive in this specific circumstance.
No, I think you should take that because you actually have a definition of it. So you should go ahead.
I mean, I think, you know, if something is producing profit, then it is productive.
Productive sort of being like what would fit into a capitalist ideal of somebody who's successful, so to speak.
Successful, or just, I mean, I think the most productive workers are the least successful ones. They're people on the front lines to keep things running. So I think productive, you know, is this producing wealth for capital,
someone else.
And so to the extent that you know, microdosing to get through a meeting can help you be a better worker, then that's a real risk.
Right.
Well, and I think, I mean, I would just add to productivity there that it can be productive for all sorts of overarching, troublesome structures, that it doesn't just have to be capital and profit, that it actually can be like productive for the sort of nuclear family model for how we should relate to each other. It can be productive for all sorts of, for the patriarchy, for whatever it is, for the racist, white supremacist culture we live in, like whatever it's feeding into. So I would say that productivity, I see it that way as well, because all those things are linked together anyway. You know, I mean, capitalism and imperialism, going to other countries and killing people, are linked together really, they're bound together really tightly. So like productive for imperialism means productive for capitalism, means profit for people who are into the nuclear family model that it supports our government in a certain way with certain economic benefits and kickbacks, right? So these things are all tied together. And so I think that the productivity for me aims in a lot of directions, but it all is in some ways a term of profit, right? I don't feel like, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, this argument that some people have made and that you just made, and maybe we'll get into it. We'll hash it out, but like, because we get into it all the time hanging out. But like that, you know, a worker deciding to take a mint to be a better worker or whatever.
And now when you say a mint, we mean a weed mint.
Right. Or like a
not just a regular mint.
No, maybe
not just so, and or like someone you know, being able to hire a sex worker so they can alleviate the pressures of the day and then go back. I actually I just don't understand why we would lump that in with something that is assisting productivity unless we're saying that the worker can never be happy. So I think that for me is a little, like, I find that a little bit of a challenging concept, you know, because I think that people should do whatever strategy they can to erode the kind of work structure that they're in when it's tied to bosses and tied to the demand to work and die, to work and have a miserable life, you know, in many different ways. They should do whatever they can to erode that, to have the kind of day that they want.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
I think that that's right, and I think both things are true. So, like, we're firmly in late capitalism where, like, loving your job makes you a better worker, being chill makes you a better worker.
Right.
So I think that my concern is that, like, edibles midday can be like the ping pong tables at Google
right.
that are like,
right.
yeah, like those moments of
And it could
release.
Also, on a personal level, do something where, if you're using a mint to de-stress from a long day or de-stress in the middle of the day, then that thing that was once nice and fun for you and the thing that you did recreationally when you were home and wanting to have a good time with yourself becomes the thing that you do to avoid work. And that's not... That's not as healthy and not as nice of a relationship with cannabis as one could have, because you're using it to escape something that makes you inevitably upset.
Right.
And I do, with this conversation, I wonder what is your guys' definition of, we've gone over productivity, what is your definition of being unproductive? How would you say that, sex work or drug work, if you want to call it that, would be a definition of unproductive? Why? What does that mean to you guys?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think where my mind goes first, although I'm not giving you a definition, sorry, but I think it's like looking at the potentiality that failure to live up to the bullshit systems that we're stuck in gives us. Mm-hmm. So, like, for instance, right now, there's so many people in the world that are unemployed.
Right.
And I think the right strategy to pull with that unemployment, of course, there's the on-the-ground material needs thing where people need to make money to, like, feed themselves or families, get insurance, all that kind of shit in this country, right? But when you look at the potentiality there, hey, there are tens of thousands of people unemployed, maybe we can create a different structure now because we're all here already. Right. So I would say rather than jumping back into the systems that are already in place that we marked with productivity before, to stand back and say, you know what, there's so many of us already here. There's so many of us here that are fed up with
that are already in that structure.
Yes, that are fed up with the like monogamous marriage and 2.5 kids structure, that are fed up with having to work and die, all that kind of stuff. There's so many of us here anyway, and we're not really able to access that system. And every time we try to access, there's a bar or it makes us debase ourselves just to get in. So now let's figure out what we can do instead. Now there's something that could play back into productivity there, and there's something that could play back into just this mindset of like, gotta get it done, there's so much shit to do, gotta get on the task today of changing the world. And then you can just, because it's really hard to get out of the cycle of the things that you've been taught
that you're not valuable if you don't do that.
So I think that's where I would start when I was thinking of what's not productive. Yeah.
And would you say that, so for sex work specifically then, I mean, based on that definition, something like, doing porn for a production company that isn't just like your own personal independent porn making would be considered productive versus something like an independent sex work versus, going to somebody and saying, here's how much money my service costs 1-to-1.
No, because the porn studio has set everything up for me, and I just got to walk in and do this athletic fucking thing for 8 hours, or up to 8 hours, and then leave. So, like, in some ways, that was actually less work than me doing all the things that you were talking about.
I see. Right. That makes sense. Yeah, because it's already there's a structure that's set up to make it so that it doesn't have to be more difficult for you versus as an independent sex worker, you have to do things like marketing and like distribution and all that stuff. Yeah. And I think that's something that's often misunderstood about sex work. Whereas, despite the fact that it is a powerful way to escape something like having a boss, it is also really, really hard. It is not like, it's so fucking hard to do, and beyond it just being a difficult job, physically with the way that people treat you outside of porn, you can... again, I'm not a sex worker, so obviously you know better than I do. But in terms of, the work itself, if you enjoy having sex, then that's okay, that's fine. But the way that people treat you outside of that is absolutely not fine and is traumatizing for a lot of people. And, I think that it's very confusing to me why, movements like the Me Too movement, for example, that are so supposed to be about, being honest and sexual liberation and making sure that women aren't being, attacked or harmed and that people are safe and not being assaulted. Why is it that sex workers who are, doing labor, physical labor, are not being included in feminist movements like that specifically?
Yeah. So let me say one thing and then I'm going to let you take it away. Okay, right? So like, I just say that sex work is like the original like modern art. Like people look at it and like porn and like prostitution.
I could do that.
Yeah, they're like, I could do that, but you couldn't and you don't.
Yep.
So shut up.
Right.
Like I don't need to hear that. It's actually a really demanding in a lot of ways skill set, and I'm not saying it's better because it's demanding or because we have to work harder.
It just
for
is.
It. But it takes a certain skill set to be able to do this. And so when I think of that, I also think of the Me Too movement, like saying, oh, well, I was I was victimized. What did they think? I was a prostitute?
Right.
And I just think, well, not only are you throwing sex workers under the bus with that in so many ways, but you're also revealing to me that you think that no skill set is needed to do that.
Yeah.
When in fact, how bizarre that a movement that is talking about navigating all the ways that sex and gender play out in our culture and seeing how much effort, and seeing how much effort it takes and how difficult it is, would think that someone who did that for a living didn't have to employ all the same kind of, effort.
Or even worse, I do hear, and I'm mostly interested in what you have to say about this topic. But just in general, people often say, when you see somebody like a Louis C.K. who's, whipping out his dick in inappropriate situations, they go, well, why didn't he just hire a prostitute?
Right.
Well, he didn't hire a prostitute because he doesn't want to do something consensually. He's not looking for a fun, consensual sex thing. He's looking to assault somebody and to make somebody upset. And so to say, why doesn't he just hire a prostitute, like specifically is saying like, oh, why don't you go and hurt this person who is trying to work for a living? And it's like, how could a feminist, a feminist movement, a movement that calls itself feminist, be vying for something like that? That's, I think that you do a lot of work in that subject. I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, well, I think anti-sex worker feminists have done such a good job of constructing sex work as non-consensual that they can't even begin to comprehend the argument you've just made.
Right.
Because they're saying, you're saying, well, you would go and hurt this person, and they think that I'll gender this for our purposes, like that her job is always already being hurt.
Right.
So it's not, there's no injury
no difference
there.
Supposedly.
Yeah. Especially because, like, per your point, the injury of so many Me Too stories is being mistaken for that kind of girl. And so, I mean, in terms of like why it can't do that, and I think there are uses of Me Too that are really incredible. I mean, right now, like the lawsuit against the Terranea, in really quite close to here, that where they've been permitting sexual harassment of their frontline janitorial and kitchen staff for years. I mean, I think this is huge, and that's really that matters. But I also think that a lot of Me Too is about correcting that category error. Yeah. And in some ways, it makes me think of like Rosa Luxemburg would like grump out on women's movements at the time, saying like that's a ladies' rights movement, not a women's rights.
Interesting.
And I think that's so like
that's funny.
Searing, right?
What did she mean by that?
Like ladies, that's for like upper class.
Oh, like for classy women who are like, oh God.
So I think we should that's the caution, right? Like how can we make sure this is not for ladies' rights?
Right. I see. Yeah. And I mean, I think that, it's so strange to me, especially amongst, like the Me Too movement was started in the movie industry with actors who often portray sex on screen like all the fucking time and will get totally naked for it, and like it's completely accepted and they'll get Oscars for it. And it's like, how, in what world is that like so different than just actually doing the sex on screen? Like it's so crazy that there's been such a crazy wall, right down the middle between what the difference is between simulated sex, which is, more or less the same thing that people are watching, except it's less difficult than actually doing porn. Like it's, insane. And I wonder, like, the aesthetics of porn are seen throughout so many different industries. And I wonder how these industries have gotten away with borrowing from those aesthetics and yet not including sex workers in their movements.
Well, that's part of the strategy, right? So, like, the very first talk I ever gave at a university was at Bowdoin College, and it was called "The Virtues of Being an Object," or "Why Ryan Gosling's Dick is Important." And the reason why was because I was talking about how in a movie you could show, like, what's the difference between pornography and just a regular movie. It's about 6 inches or however big Ryan Gosling's dick I imagine it to be. 25 inches. But it's like
in an ideal world.
So like the idea being that like as soon as you show a certain kind of interaction of body parts, suddenly society is in danger. And that's completely crazy, right? But I think that there's something behind that that's really a big problem that we have to face, which is that people say sex sells all the time. It's not true. porn, yes, is sex selling because we're actually engaging in, we're showing images and representations of it. But what sells is frustrated arousal. So when you show like, you don't ever see like a giant billboard with like a pussy like going around a dick and they're like fucking and it's like buy Budweiser, right? No, it's like here's someone that we're going to arouse you with and then we're going to divert your arousal into the beer or the computer or whatever. So your only way of consummating the relationship is by buying this product, right? And so by doing that, to continue doing that, they actually have to cut sex work out of the picture. Because if you were watching like two people fuck and like they were trying to sell you a product, you're going to concentrate more probably on the people fucking. And I'm not saying that that's necessary. There's a lot of things we can do about our own like versions of desire and what we're attracted to and not attracted to, but that's a strategy. And so by necessity, they have to cut out sex workers who are actually doing that.
Because otherwise, you know, people would go and be giving the money that they would be using to buy a Budweiser to a sex worker, presumably. You know,
and to continue that, they have to make us feel guilty about accessing sex workers.
And they have to make the sex workers themselves, you know, ideally feel guilty that they're doing the sex work in the first place. And that, you know, that's something that functions with their lifestyle, you know, and that works. And I mean, I do often think about, because, you know, I am married to a cis white man. Like I've got like a very traditional relationship. Yeah, right? Like, please forgive me. But, you know, I see you tweeting a lot, Conner, and I like every time you tweet about it, like I agree with you that like the nuclear family is fucked and like we don't need to be supporting that anymore. I think it's dumb, you know. I think that like plenty of people would be much happier not in things like monogamous relationships, and I think that all of this is sort of inextricably tied together where, you know, you don't get to talk about sex outside of a mother and a father having sex with each other, you know, and you don't get to seem to enjoy sex, or you don't get to think about sex unless it's for a product or unless it's for having a baby, you know. And
it's a product.
Yeah, which is also a product. Yes, exactly.
Especially designer baby, right?
Yeah. God help us all.
I can't wait till designer abortions come along. It's going to be like really amazing.
I will get one right away. Yeah, that sounds dope. I'm down. But, you know, I think that in addition to being a threat to capitalism, it's a threat to the nuclear family, you know, things like sex work, because theoretically, you know, I personally know plenty of people who are married and the only sex that they have outside of their marriage is with sex workers, and that works for them. That's what they do. They prefer it, you know. It makes them feel more comfortable, it makes them feel whatever. And that, I would imagine, would be significantly more popular if we didn't say that sex was bad all the time, you know. And I see what's happening with cannabis right now, just to bring it back to that. And I see, you know, it becoming acceptable in certain areas, and I see, you know, these companies that are shifting to sort of market to like middle-aged white people, you know, like, and things like that. And I mean, it just seems like, to me, doing research for this, the one thing that I came out of thinking was that the bigger an industry gets, the worse it is. And that, you know, the more that it's going to be enforcing things like a nuclear family or like a capitalist system where the workers aren't happy. And I wonder if there's anything we can do about it, and if you guys have any insights in terms of, you know, structurally or individually, what can be done about industries that get so fucking huge that they aren't accepting of people like us anymore.
Go ahead, fix it.
Please fix it. All right, pitch me. Go.
I also want to say, like, small business owners are terrible.
Yeah.
So I don't think we don't need like a mom and pop, including in porn.
Yeah, that's like a little libertarian for my taste.
Artisanal porn is not the answer.
Well, right. Let me just say one thing. Yeah. It's literally a sentence, and then get back to it, which is that like I forget who said it, but it's very true that like the difference between feminist porn and mainstream porn is that if you're a performer, you get paid less to do feminist porn. That's really, it's like naturally, like all the focus on the content and not the focus on the workers. Right. But go ahead.
Yeah. And I mean, let me just say that the porn for women sections of porn sites are always like bullshit, weird stuff that I don't actually want to watch. Like, it's not actually for women. They're just like, oh, let's take like the weird, shitty, like Kama Sutra video where no one's naked and like throw it in there. Like, no big deal.
Well, I think now, I mean, the market's so expanded, you could get anything that's called porn for women. Right. And the major difference would be pay for the worker. Right. Yeah. Yeah. You can, there's a flavor for any kind of low paid.
Which is just another result of, you know, an industry getting big enough that they realize that there is money in a independent version of this thing. And so they can kind of fake the idea of being an independent thing and being independent sex work, feminist sex work. And in reality, they're just adopting those terms to, make it so that it seems like it is more, nicer to the workers or better in some capacity. And I guess I wonder what, as individuals, can we do to prevent that from happening to our communities and to the sex work community and the drug community, that our culture that we've worked so hard to illegally, create is then being adopted by people who are profiting off it that aren't us. Right. And, I think this a lot about the cannabis community. I wonder what you guys think about that in terms of sex work.
Yeah. Do you want to start?
No, you go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think two things, one that's a little more doable now and then one that's longer range. And the first is, I think unionizing is the best way for workers to have collective power. And that seems the labor movement will have to deal with its own respectability politics to really get on board, but SEIU should absolutely be hounding MedMen.
100%.
So
fucking unionize MedMen.
Your funding taken away, but
we don't get funded by MedMen. Don't worry about that. But MedMen sucks.
I think to realize that some of these contradictions cannot be resolved under this economic system.
Right.
So then what? So I think we also have to do what we can to survive better now, but also always remember that it can never be enough.
Right. And that, we have to be working individually to change the system and not necessarily just, I guess it's a balance between making sure that you can survive and be happy personally and making sure that you're pushing for it. And Conner, I wonder what you...
Yeah, well, I mean, the first thing I want to say is I don't I think it's useful for sex workers to talk with each other about what could make their studios and work experiences better. But I don't think it's useful for anybody who's not invested serious time like Heather has, creating bridges and allyships with people in the porn world and in the sex worker communities to make those critiques at all.
Right.
Porn is already a strike against so many of the things that are upholding power right now. It's already people define the sexual sort of rule and law of the day. It's already saying, the workers have chosen to present desire and sexuality where that's forbidden in so many cases, even against all the odds of employment discrimination, payment processor discrimination, having your bank account closed, having your partner want to leave you, all that kind of stuff is doing so much of that work already that I think that the conversation to be had in that space is amongst people that are either in it or seriously allied with it. So I don't even want to really come down on porn that much. I think however big it gets, that doesn't mean I think that there's nothing wrong with it. I think there's plenty that can be improved, and I've done a lot of work to try to do that, right? But I think that when it comes to, when it comes to cannabis, and I would say the sort of same kind of thing, except I would say that there's more of a precedent for it in our culture with other kinds of substances and other, movements in history. So I think that you can sort of look to some of those things.
The prohibition movement and all of that.
Yeah, and obviously that didn't go very well. I mean, the alcohol companies, they all have faced this kind of issues that you brought up.
Yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
And so, I mean, I think I agree with Heather that some of these, it's not that I think that they're not resolvable. I think probably if we really put ourselves to the task, we could resolve them in some way. But I think that if we did that really hardcore, we actually wouldn't want to resolve them anymore. Actually,
interesting.
By the time we got to the solution, we wouldn't want it anymore.
Why do you think that is?
Well, it's kind of the same reason when you say in reverse, someone wanting to become a politician or a senator. It's well, they might have these really good intentions, but by the time they get there, they've gone stared into the fucking dark crystal for so long that all the goodness has been sapped out of their being, and they've become this person, and so I think it's the opposite almost. It's once you do enough development to figure out a way to solve these problems that you're talking about and find compassionate solutions that actually enable people to be free, and that enable people to be self-actualized, you no longer want to support any kind of economic system that would be solving these problems in a marginal way anyway. You want larger structural change.
Right. Yeah, and I guess that is perhaps why any political movement, any social movement is a multi-generational effort, because You know, you need that. Unfortunately, I would love to be able to be like, all right, like I solved it. Like the system is better, you know, and I think every activist would love that, you know, and I think that's kind of what we're all in an abstract way, like reaching towards. But at the same time, it's the kind of thing that needs effort from older people who have been in the movement for a longer time and fresh young faces who are coming into the movement and seeing the current problems from a new light. You know, I always tell myself, if I just listen to the teens for my whole life, then I will never get too conservative. I will never go too far right. You know, if you just listen to the young people about what they're talking about and what their concerns are, you're always going to be okay. And I feel like that kind of applies to sex workers too, in a broad way. You know, obviously it's not like a all-encompassing role, but I think if you're trying to be an activist for any reason, you need to go and talk to the people most affected by the cause that you're dealing with. And so if you're trying to be an ally to sex workers, like a really good thing to do is to let sex workers speak for themselves. Like I see a lot of people talking about porn who aren't in porn, who know nothing about porn. And how is that helpful? You know, I think what you're saying is really like correct, that we need to be going to the lowest level of the people who are the most affected and letting them be the voice that's starting that movement. You know, but I think
But it's never done that way.
Yeah.
I mean, it's never done that way. Not with sex workers. Almost never. Like, you know, there was this article in the New York Times like a while ago, New York Times Magazine cover article about like how are teen boys being affected by porn. It's by this woman, Maggie Jones. It was a piece of shit article. Yeah. And this woman was like an MFA professor in Pittsburgh and who is for some reason obsessed with what teenage boys jerk off to. So she spent like a year at this high school like talking to them. Obviously, to me, that's a displaced, distorted
as
fantasy.
Hell. That's so weird.
But the thing is, she had no qualification to like write this. She didn't know anything about porn history. She didn't know. It didn't seem like she knew anything about art history, and pornography is art. It didn't seem like she knew anything about sex workers' rights, sex workers' movements. She certainly didn't know about how desire interacted with sexual assault. Right. I mean, because the whole premise was that somehow things were worse now, and it's like, did you think that like teenage boys were doing great before internet porn came along? I think that there was a lot of sexual assault then. In fact, the rape culture that you're trying to address emerges out of not having this. Yeah. So maybe out of having no discussion about sexual pleasure or what have you. So maybe we need to stand back and have a different, conversation. Absolutely. So I'm using that as like, that article particularly miffed me because it came out also at the same time as a lot of other anti-sex work sentiment was on the rise. Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of, it's like, I would just say, if you're a journalist, don't write about porn.
Yeah,
like, just don't.
Unless you were previously a porn star before you were a journalist,
or if you've done so much work. Like, I think, John Ronson did this series, The Butterfly Effect, which I'm not just saying this because I was quoted
the podcast?
Yeah,
I listened. I loved it.
But it was really good.
It was fantastic, yeah.
But he spent hours and hours and hours and hours and hours talking to so many different porn performers, and that's why it turned out well. Right. And there's still some things in there that are a little objectionable, but even he's like, well, I don't really know. Right? Yeah. And so I'm not saying he'll always be responsible just because he was responsible that one time either. Because then when you engage in a new project, you have all kinds of... So that's what I would say is like, if you're thinking of speaking, like, just don't. Yeah. Like, unless you've secured that work and you know that you're, like, in and you have the ability to speak. And I know you're actually in that position where you're, like, engaging with porn communities, not having made porn. But it was very apparent to me the first time I met you that you do that really well and that your questions and your ability to sit and listen and take it in and, like, have some kind of analysis about it really matter, Thanks. So, yeah, and I'm not just saying that to praise you. I think I'm also saying that to, like, get you to talk about, like, how you did that, Yeah,
that's definitely something I'd be interested in hearing about.
Yeah, I want to get into feminist research methods on this.
All right, let's go. 3 more hours. We're doing it.
No, but I think being willing to be, and I'd done a lot of different hustles, so, that were adjacent. But so that gave me some sense of, like, how not to do this research. Right. But having been on the other side of that. But I think, like, being willing to be proven wrong is really important. Like, so our first conversation, Conner said, like, don't call me a porn worker. I'm a constellation. And
porn stars.
That's beautiful. I love that.
and it really, like, restructured my whole book.
Thinking
about that tension.
Because it's so important, to know when people, tell me that I'm saying something that offends them, I'm like, thank you. Like, now I know not to say that, I think that's...
But
that's
other people, then I started asking, and most of your colleagues were like, nope, I'm a worker.
Right.
And so, but actually that tension is the most, I think, generative piece now.
Right.
So, but that wouldn't have been possible. I think a lot of research, it comes in with the impulse to smooth these tensions over. And I think, what Marxism lets you do is think that tension is the most important part. Wow. So that lets you listen to Conner, even when you're being incendiary for fun.
I'm never.
No.
I'm always agreeable, sweet.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, but it was such an important intervention.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great note to leave off on. Yeah. I wanna do some plugs for you guys. First of all, Conner's podcast is amazing, and I listen to every single episode. It's called Against Everyone with Conner Habib. Yeah. There's a Patreon page where people can listen. Is that right?
Yeah, Patreon. So it's patreon.com/Conner Habib. And so that's everything that supports the show is that,
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, so give him money.
Full-time job, my full-time job. So I don't really have a job. So it would be really great to not have bosses, but instead have people who loved what I was doing contribute and be supportive. Yeah. And they do, and I'd love more of that.
Great. So, so check out his Patreon page. I've looked at it myself, and I donate myself. There's small amounts of money and large amounts of money, so whatever you have, give this man money. He does good work. And Heather is coming out with a book, I believe, and she's currently teaching classes at USC. What else do you have in the pipeline?
Oh, yeah, the book's a ways off, but if you'll remember, you can find it. It's still called Porn Work, even though you told me not to. But
Porn Constellation really wouldn't sell well on the academic press.
Yeah, I buy
it. But you can find me at Twitter at Dr. Heather Berg.
Great. Yeah, and we'll put both of those links in the description. Okay. And thank you again for listening. Remember to rate and subscribe. And remember to like us on Apple Podcasts. And shout out to the Green Angels for providing their lovely weed. And thanks for listening.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
I'm chilling with the queens of the Stone Age.